Hey everyone, so as promised in my last video, in this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint this painting using my brush set. If you haven't already seen my last video, I opened my brush set and just went through each of the brushes and did some demonstrations showing how I would use the brushes and the different textures you can create. So if you're interested in that, make sure to go back and watch that video first. So today we'll be using a couple of brushes from the set to do this forest painting. Let me go through the materials I'm using so you can follow along with me. And also when my brush set officially launches in a few days time, I will be doing a live stream where I'll be doing another demo painting, so you can join in and paint with me while asking me any questions. And yeah, I hope you'll be able to make that as well. It'll be my first live stream on YouTube, so I'm really nervous but excited for it. The paints that I'll be using today is the Himi gouache paints. Feel free to use any gouache paints that you have. In terms of the colors that I'll be using, I recommend that you just have the primary colors, the cool and warms in each of the primaries. So a cool yellow, a warm yellow, cool red, warm red, cool blue, warm blue, and then just burnt umber, black and white. And any additional colors that you have, like pre-mixed greens and things like that, can come in handy but are not absolutely necessary. I'll just be using 3 brushes from the set. I'll be using the 1/2 inch flat brush, the size 8 round brush, and if you watched the last video you'll remember that this one is the one with the softer hairs, so it's really great for creating a lot of textures that we'll be doing in this painting. And then the size 1 liner brush. The paper I'm using is just 300 GSM watercolor paper, and the size is A6. I like to cut my paper size down to a smaller size so that way I can do the painting in a faster time so that the video is not too long for you guys to follow along with. And I prefer 300 GSM for gouache paintings because that weight of paper is good enough to hold a few layers of water and paint without buckling. I have found that with different brands of paper, sometimes when you peel off the tape, some papers will still remain flat while others will start to curve a little. So I think that just depends on the brand, but for the most part, when you're painting, the paper shouldn't buckle too much. You can also use lighter weight paper for gouache. I have a Moleskine sketchbook which only has 165 GSM papers, and it's perfectly fine for gouache as well. It's just that the paper will buckle a little bit more. Some other things I have here are this water tank. This one I bought it online when I was in China, so I'm not sure exactly where you can find the same thing. You can try searching for ceramic water tanks and hopefully you can find something similar. It is quite heavy. I like this one because it fits into the frame well for my tutorials, but if you do get one, I would recommend that you get a larger size. I would prefer if this was bigger, but it wouldn't fit into my camera frame as nicely, so I opted for the smaller one. And then I've just got a towel here for wiping my brushes off. You can use tissues or paper towels. I always just prefer a towel like this because it's a lot more absorbent, and after a painting session or two I can just rinse it out and use it again. I've also got a spray bottle with me which I use to just mist the paints to keep them fresh in here, and also sometimes on my palette if I notice it's drying out. And lastly, you'll just want a pencil and eraser just to do a quick sketch before we start painting. So let's just start with the sketch first, and I'm just going to kind of split the painting up into where the trees are and where the path kind of disappears. I think I want to place it at a little bit below the 1/3 line. So if I section this off into thirds, I want it around here, maybe a little bit less space. And then you can just loosely sketch in the shape of the path, which is smaller in the distance and widens out as it comes towards us. I always like painting paths because they help to instantly just create depth in the painting, and it leads our eye into the painting. So this reference photo is one that I took myself when I went hiking, and it's from a national park in Tasmania. And then you'll want to just loosely sketch in where the tree trunks are. So we've got this main thick one over here. And I'm going to make it just go all the way up, even though it gets covered mostly by trees, by the leaves up there. And then we've got a cluster on the right hand side over here, as well as one in the far background here. So make sure you leave a little bit of a gap there. And you can be really loose with this because you can't go too wrong with it. So just loosely place in those trees and that path. And then with the eraser here, I'm just going to fix up a few things. And maybe just bring this in a little, it's kind of going off center. And that's all I'm going to do for the sketch. And if you've made any lines that are very dark, you can use your eraser to just lightly go over it. I'm using a kneadable eraser here, which is great for lightening lines without completely erasing them. And then we're going to start with the 1/2 inch flat brush today. So I like to just soak it with a little bit of water to start with. And the way we're going to approach this painting is a little different from most of my tutorials. Usually I work with very creamy opaque paint and work from the top to bottom, working from back to front, but today I'm going to work from a thin consistency and gradually build up the opacity. And I feel like this approach works better for this kind of painting because there's a lot more tiny details and complexity in this painting, and so I want to map out where everything is using a very thin layer of gouache first, and then as I flesh out the details more, I build up the opacity. So that's the approach I'm going to use today. So we're going to start with a lot of water in the brush, and you'll see that my paint consistency will be very thin. And first I'm just going to block in the background with a light blue, and then I'll layer on some of the green for the foliage. So we'll start with this blue, and I'm going to want to mix it with white to just lighten it and keep it very light. And I'm dipping into the water because I want to keep this very thin. So if you start with very thin paint, if you make mistakes, you can easily cover it with thicker opaque paint. So that's one of the advantages of working this way. And with that very pale color, I'm just going to sweep that into the background. It's better to go a little bit thinner than too thick at this stage. And I kind of just left the tree trunks out, but it doesn't matter if you go over them a little as well. And then I'll want to sweep in the greens that I can see. So one of the things to watch out for when you're painting a scene like this is make sure to vary your greens. If they're all the same shade of green, it's going to become boring very quickly. So something I look for is whether a green is more of a blue green or more of a yellow green. Is it very dark? Is it more like an olive green? So try and pick out those subtleties in the green that you see, and that way you just have a lot more variety in your painting and will make it look more realistic. So for example, in this kind of section, I see it more as a paler pastel green, so a little bit more of a blue green, and then up here maybe a little bit more olive green, and same with here, a little bit darker, a little bit more of a blue green here as well. And then for those bright leaves that are catching the sunlight, those are a lot more yellow green. So for the green, what I'll do is I'll mix in a little bit of yellow, so I still have the same paint mixture, and a little bit of blue. And this kind of green is a bit unnatural, so using the lemon yellow and this blue will produce very vibrant green. So I'm going to tone it down with a little bit of warm blue, so the ultramarine blue. And if that's not enough, I can add a touch of red into it, which also just kind of mutes it a little bit. And then I'm going to look for those big patches of greens that I was saying. So over here, I think it's a little bit more of a darker blue green, so I like to use a bit more ultramarine blue for that. And if you're worried about getting the color wrong or something, just thin your paint down so it's very pale, and that way you can always cover it up. So I think this green is still a little bit too vibrant, so I'm just going to tone it down a little bit more with a tiny bit more red in the mixture. And you can use the yellow ochre or the warm yellow to mix up more dull greens. So just play around with that. I like this kind of green a little bit better, just for those duller areas. Still keeping the paint very thin, and I just want to just sweep in these colors a little. And then maybe I'll make it a little bit more vibrant with some of this blue, and find areas with a bit more vibrant green and just block it in. So in this first stage, I'm just trying to block in all of the white of the paper with very thin down paint. And we've got a bit of a sky hole here, so try and leave a little bit of it with the background there, but if you cover it, we can always come back in later and poke in those holes. And then next I want to just block in the ground as well, so I'll just clean off my brush here. And we can block in the path and the ground and then the trees. So for the ground, we'll mix up a grey using burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And you want to mix it with white. And also just add water to it to make it very thin, so it's still looking a bit too blue, so I'm adding in some more burnt umber. And white just to lighten it. Still too blue. Oh, now I think I've pushed it too much to burnt umber, so I'm going back into the blue a little. And then I also want it to be really light, so I'm just going to clean this off. I've got too much paint on the brush, and I'm just going to thin this down and then paint on the path. So because the paint is very thin, I don't have to worry much about making mistakes. I know they can all be very easily covered with thicker paint as I go. And then for the ground on the side, I'm going to use some burnt umber again. Maybe with a little bit of white just to lighten it a bit, and just very loosely just block that in. So it might all look a little bit funny right now, but as we kind of sculpt things out, it should start to make more sense. I'm just going to lighten that a little bit. Okay, let's block in the tree trunks. So for that, I'm just going to use burnt umber again. I'll start down here. And maybe a little bit of burnt sienna. If you don't have burnt sienna, don't worry. You don't need it. You can just mix in some reds into this. And maybe a little bit of ultramarine blue, because that will just make the color a little bit darker. Oops, I put a bit too much there. Some more burnt umber. And again, with fairly thin paint, you're just going to want to place it in. So I like using this brush on its side so I can get thinner lines. And then for that tree at the back, I'm also just going to block it in. Okay, and now I'm just going to wash off the brush. And then you can just let things quickly dry if you don't want to work wet into wet. And we'll start on the next layer where our paint's going to be a little bit more creamy. And also I'm just going to give my paints a quick mist because it's a very hot day here and they're starting to dry out already. Now I'm going to switch to my size 8 round brush, and if you've never painted in this way where you paint from thin to thick, you might be thinking that the painting looks really funny at this stage, but just trust in the process and keep going, and the painting will start to come together eventually. So let's keep going. So with the size 8 round brush, I'm going to, I think I'll work from the back over here and along the sides and build up the foliage, and then paint the trees on top of that. So starting with this area here, I want to mix up a darker green for this section, then a bit of a brighter green up here. And now the paint that I'll be using will be a little bit thicker in consistency so that it can cover the background. So for the color down here, because I know I want it to be more of a dull green, I'm going to start with ultramarine blue, which just when mixed with a yellow will produce a more dull green, and I'll mix it with a little bit of yellow ochre. And a little bit of the lemon yellow. And now I'm going to keep the paint quite dry actually, because I want to start using some textures to scrub on details. So I will be using a little bit of a dry brush texture. Now I'm just going to mix in a bit more blue. So some ways you can mix a dull green is to use a warm blue and a warm yellow, or you can also add red to the mixture if it's still not dull enough. So as I'm picking up the paint here, I move my brush in a way so that the hairs will split apart. So if you just kind of push down on the brush and twist a little, see the hairs here will just kind of come apart, and it will have textures along here, and then you can strategically use these textures to create texture on your painting. So with fanned out hairs like this, and make sure the brush is not too wet. So here if I just scrub on some texture like this, you can see it's giving me a lot more than just a flat color. Now if you find there's too much water on the brush, just wipe it off a little on your towel, and that way you can scrub like this without placing down too much water. And that's how I'm going to create some of the textures over here. I'm going to mix in a little bit more blue because I want the green to be a bit more blue. Oh, now I've got a bit too much. I'm going to put some yellow ochre into the mixture. And again, just kind of pressing down on my brush, fanning it out like this, give it a bit of a twist, and then wiping off any excess moisture if there is, and just scrubbing in a little bit of texture. So I can see this darker part down here. It's more of a dark green, so that's what I'm trying to put in there now. And I'm just doing dry brush textures to get that in. And something else you can do is stippling. So pinch the base of the hairs like this, and then tap for textures. But we'll get to that in a little bit. For now, I'm just going to quickly scrub on the textures like this. And then for this section, I want it to be more of a paler green. So I'm going to clean off that and just pick up some yellow and mix it with the cool blue color, which will produce a really vibrant green. And then you're going to just want to mix that with white, and you'll get this really pastel color. There is a green in the Himi set that is quite similar. You can use that pre-mixed green if you want, but I also like to just have control over my colors so that I can mix them how I want to. And then I'm just going to scrub in some of that lighter, that paler, brighter green in there. Add a bit more white to it and maybe touch more yellow. So the background is pretty much already this color, so it doesn't stand out that much. So you can maybe scrub it up around here where the sky hole is, just to get rid of some of that harsh edge. And again, all of this is all a dry brush texture. In the previous video I talked about this. It's like scumbling over the paper. And then we've got some darker greens up here again, so I might just go into this green and mix the two together and just brush a little bit of that in. And I think I want a bit more yellow in all of this, so I've picked up some yellow ochre and I'm just going to tap in a little bit, and then we'll paint in the tree trunks. So you can stick with this round brush or you can switch to a liner brush to do this. I'll stick with this one for now, and then if I want to do some really thin lines I'll switch. So for the tree trunks I'll keep it simple, just using this burnt umber and blue mixture, and maybe just make it a little bit lighter because things in the distance are a bit lighter in value, so we don't want it to be too dark. We want the trees on the sides to be a little bit darker. So with this mixture I'm just going to paint in those tree trunks which just reach up, and as they reach towards the sky they become even lighter in value, so I will want to add some more white to it. So you can see, even though this is a size 8 round brush, because it has such a pointed tip, I can paint really thin lines with it. I'm just painting some branches coming off of the tree trunks. And then I'll add a little bit more white and just lighten the tops of the tree trunks, just so it looks like the light is reaching them up the top. And we can stipple some foliage over them as well, just so that they look like they're more integrated. And I'm going to mix a little bit of burnt sienna into it. Bit of white, bit of burnt sienna. Again, if you don't have burnt sienna, just use a little bit of red. Place in some lighter ones so as to suggest they're more in the distance. And some of them reach all the way up here. Then I'm just going to wash it off, and we're just going to paint in some foliage on top of that. So now I'll pick up some of the cool yellow, the lemon yellow, and I'll mix up some more of a brighter green. So I'll use the cool blue, this blue here, and the lemon yellow, and a little bit of white, and maybe a bit more yellow just to make it more of a warmer green, more of a yellow green than a blue green. And this is when I'm going to do a little bit of stippling. So after loading my brush with paint, I'm just going to pinch at the very base and see how the hairs just fan out. Now if they clump together again, that could be because there's too much moisture in the brush. So what you can do is, on your towel or tissue, just take off a little bit of the paint and moisture from the base, not from the tip. And give it a good pinch. And you can now start stippling. So here I'm just going to tap on these details. And you've got a really nice texture coming from the shape of the brush. And I'm going to tap over these branches. I'll add a little bit of warm yellow. So when you're doing this, try and just vary up your greens a little. Don't use the exact same mixture every time, otherwise the greens will become too alike and not very realistic. And you can tap around the top as well. Just get some of that color and texture in, and you can scrub over like this because your brush is quite dry. So just getting those textures and those colors in there. I want some more darker greens now, so I'm going to the blue. So see how after every time I'm just switching up the green a little bit, just to get that variety in there. We can always come back and fix up these small details. So for now, I'll kind of leave that section, and then as I do more of the painting, I'll reevaluate how it is and change things as needed or add more things. And so now I'm going to expand out and work on all of the foliage around here and just block in those big colors. So I'll start with the scumbling technique, where I go over large areas of the foliage with a dry brush using the side of my brush, so I can just get those textures in, and then I'll paint in the branches and the tree trunks and then stipple on some details. So let's mix up some greens for these remaining areas. So I'll just go into the blue that I have on my palette and mix it with some yellows. So you don't have to follow exactly what I'm doing. I would encourage you to play around with the combinations of blues and yellows to see what kind of greens you can get, and then just use reds to tone down the color. And you can add white to make the greens more of a pastel color. And so for the technique, I'm going to just take off some paint and moisture and just dry brush, scratch it on. I think I want it to be a bit more blue with a bit more of a pastel color, so I'll mix in a bit more white. And it can help if you kind of spread out the bristles like that, and then using the side of the brush, I'm scrubbing on the color. And I'm just scrubbing these on wherever I see fit. I'm gonna go for some more olive green, so I'll use some yellow ochre and blue and a bit of red. And if you find your greens are becoming too dull, I just add in a little bit of the cool blue, and that usually brings it back. A lot of this color mixing knowledge just comes with practice. So it starts by maybe learning some of the theory behind it, and then the more you practice it, the more it just sticks. So now when I mix greens, I know how to vary the greens by adding different colors. I know what will happen if I add the lemon yellow, or what will happen if I add ultramarine blue. It takes a little bit of the guesswork out of mixing color. So now I'm back to stippling a bit more, so just pinching and tapping. And that's just because I want some different textures in here. So it's important to both mix up the colors you're using and mix up the texture. And down here it's much more of a darker green, so I'll even mix a bit of burnt umber into it just to mute that green a little bit. And just place a little into here. And down here. And then I'll put in some brighter greens, then I'll place in the tree trunks. So for the brighter greens, I'm going to use more of the lemon yellow and maybe some ultramarine blue. And I'm going to stipple with this. Tone it down a little bit by going to the more dull green. There's so much you can do with dry brushing, so many textures and just so many ways to place the paint onto the paper. Okay, now I'll do the tree trunks properly. So this base layer was very loose. So with the round brush, I'm just going to fix up the tree trunks and place them in a bit more accurately and with thicker paint. Right now it's very thin, so it's good because it can be covered easily. But and so we can start to work on the details more. So maybe I'll start with the one in the background. So this one here, I like to make this one a little bit warmer, so using some burnt sienna mixed with burnt umber. And I don't want to make it too dark because I want the other trees that are closer to us to be a bit darker. And I'll mix some more burnt sienna into it for the lighter sides. And a little bit of warm yellow, so place in some warm yellow to warm up the color. And a bit of pink maybe. So there's some darker shadows in here, which helps to shape this tree trunk. It's a bit flat at the moment, so I use some burnt umber and just try to get that in there to help with the shape of it, and then we'll move on to the other trees. So we can start with the main one on the right. I'll start with a darker color. So just using burnt umber and a little bit of ultramarine blue and a bit of burnt sienna. And the tree trunk's a little bit lighter up the top as it's closer to the light, so I'll keep that in mind. For now I'm going to deepen the shadow on the left side. I'm mainly just using burnt umber. And I think a bit of dry brush texture helps here as well. Now as it curves around, it's a little bit lighter on the other side, so I'll go into the lighter mixture here, and I want a little bit more yellow in the mixture and a bit of burnt sienna or red. And just lighten it as it curves around, and as it goes up it's much lighter up here. And I'll use foliage to cover this top area too. I don't want it to be too dark and to stand out too much. So once I've got that shape in, I can use a clean brush to soften out some transitions. And then it's a matter of kind of just carving out the shape a bit better. First I'm going to really try and darken that left side. So I'll mix some more ultramarine blue into the burnt umber and just try and add a really dark shadow to the left side, and also to this part which where the tree trunk goes in again, so here, and then you just slowly transition out. And we can fix up the details as we kind of paint in the ground and more of the foliage around it. And then we'll just paint in some more branches, so using the same mixture. We can paint the one that's in here. And I think we'll keep the shadows on the left sides of all these trees. Now, if you're finding it difficult to control the round brush and get thin strokes, feel free to switch to the liner brush. It is available, but I will save that for a little bit later. And we're going to need to fill in this ground area too, so I might do that next, so that way when I paint the trees they're sitting on top of the ground and I don't have to paint that again. So for the ground, we'll keep it nice and simple. I don't want to get into too much of the details in there, as I want the focus to be on the trees. So I'm just going to mix up some burnt umber. And using a still slightly thinned down consistency, but a little bit thicker than the first layer we placed down, I'm just going to very loosely kind of suggest what's happening on the ground. So we can also use this to carve into the shape of the tree a little bit, and I want this ground to not be too dark, so I'm going to mix in some white. It definitely has to be a lot lighter than the trees itself. Just mixing in some burnt umber and keeping it light by keeping the mixture thin. And I don't want to make the place where the foliage connects with the ground very obvious, so I just kind of suggest at it. I'm not going to paint it very clearly, if that makes sense. And then same for here, just I know I'm meeting the trees somewhere, but I'm just going to keep it vague. Sometimes it can look very awkward where a tree meets the ground, so I try not to draw too much attention to it. And you can use the foliage to kind of cover up that area a little so it looks a little bit less awkward. And using some of the textures on the brush, again, you can just kind of get that into the ground. Make sure the paint isn't too thin though. You do want a little bit more coverage this time around. And you can also tap like this with your brush to get some textures in. I'm just going to make it a little bit lighter with some white. Get a little bit of burnt sienna into there. Maybe just tap in some textures like this. Very loose. Wash it off and just with a clean brush just soften out that color a little bit. And for the distance, I want to keep it nice and light and just fill that in a little bit. Again, trying not to draw too much attention to where the ground meets. I'm going to fill it in with a bit more of the foliage color. So I'm just going back into my green, maybe mixing some burnt umber in there. So I'm bridging the two colors. And hopefully just not drawing too much attention here. And while we're doing this, we'll work on the path a little bit as well, just because it's joined together. So on the path, we've got the dappled light coming through the trees, which is one of my favorite things about this painting and is kind of what drew me in to take a photo of it. So first I'm going to soften the space between the path and the dirt, just because there's a dirt kind of coming onto the path, so I want that to be soft. I don't want a very harsh line there. And then for the path itself, I think now that the side is a bit darker, it probably makes me want to make the path a bit darker too. Let me just finish fixing up this area. Okay, so for the path, we can kind of keep it, we can make it a little bit darker. So I'll mix a bit of burnt umber into the ultramarine blue over here, which is the color of the path. Maybe a bit more burnt umber, it's a bit too blue. And I'll just go over this. And just remember that the valley will dry a little bit lighter. And so where the light comes through, mostly in this middle part, will make it lighter. For now, I think I'll just make this overall darker value. And then we can go in with some white, so adding some white to the mixture and just getting some of that light in, starting to suggest a little bit at the dappled light coming through. and I'm just using the brush on its side like this, and it's coming through diagonally. And I'm just making sure there is a roundness to this path. I want it to look like it's coming from the distance and curving around. Maybe I want it a little bit lighter than the dirt, so I'm going to add a bit more white, because if the two are too similar in value, it's hard to tell them apart. Okay, so we've got a little bit of the dirt details in on the path over here, so we can start painting in some more of the tree trunks now that we have this kind of done. And we'll come back to work on the path a little bit more. So let's go back to painting in the tree trunks. Again, I'm going to go into the burnt umber mixture, and you can mix in a bit of the warm yellows and a bit of red or burnt sienna. And now starting on this side, I'm going to paint in the trees over here. So they extend down here and go up. I'm just mixing in some more burnt umber and ultramarine blue. These ones here, they're quite dense, very close to one another, but I do leave a little bit of a gap between them. And then just want to paint a couple of thin ones. So you might want to lighten it a little bit to push it back in space a little bit. If they're all very dark, it'll look like they're all very close to us. And still, I'm only just using my round brush to do all these thin strokes. It's got a pointed enough tip that it can handle these very thin lines very well. And then just imagine these branches coming through, and the branches don't have to connect perfectly. You can leave some gaps between them so that way it looks like the foliage is poking through. And then you're just going to want to add a little bit of white to the mixture and just lighten the trees a little bit on their right side. So the light is coming from the right, so we'll lighten them on that side just so they look a bit more rounded. And also up the top, probably makes sense to make them a bit lighter as they're receiving more of the sunlight. And later we'll paint a bit of green onto them, just to show some of the moss that's growing on the trees. So now cleaning that off, I'm just going to smooth out that transition a little. And let's just get some more branches in. Now I'll just switch to this liner brush and go into the paint here. Still the same burnt umber mixture, and I'll just paint in a lot more of these finer branches. So just getting these really thin branches in. Don't worry too much about making them perfect. We're going to paint foliage over the top of them, so a lot of it will get covered, but we just need to have some there so that it peeks through. And there's actually one more thicker tree over here. I think I'll get that in. So and you can have some branches coming off, and don't be afraid to have some branches that, you know, growing down or in a different direction. If they all grow in the same direction, it will look a little bit too unnatural. So just study what you see in the photo and switch things up a little. Don't make it all exactly the same. Now I'm going to use a little bit of a lighter color for the branches in the background because I don't want them to stand out too much. And we can also add any final branches later if we want to. So let's go back to stippling on the foliage. I think I'll start with maybe some lighter colors now, some brighter greens, which I've saved for towards the end. So for the brighter green, I'll use the cool yellow add a bit of white just to lighten that up, and then maybe a little bit of ultramarine blue so that way the green's not too unnatural. And let me just test out that color a little, so when I go to stipple, here I am just pinching. So I think it's a nice bright color. And you want to save these brighter colors for the much lighter parts of the foliage, so you don't want to brighten everything up. You want to just highlight those areas that really are brighter. So around this side I'm seeing a lot more brighter colors. Adding in a little bit more yellow to it. Then after this, I think I'll go in with some darker green to emphasize some shadows and create some more contrast. So that's how I like to paint. I like to go back and forth between light and dark, and that for me I find is a quick way to bring out the depth in this painting. Make sure you paint over the tree trunks a little. You don't want them to be standing out very clearly. So I'm happy with some of the lighter accents. I think I'll stop there before I overdo it and just clean up the brush and go into a bit of a darker color. I'll go into my warm blue, my ultramarine blue. Add a little bit of red into it just to dull it down, a little bit of yellow. I want a more dull down green, so it's a bit too vibrant right now. I'm just playing around with my blues and yellows. Might even add some burnt umber to it, and I first want to fill in some gaps that I've got here. So I'm trying to do it with a muted color. I've just got some gaps between the trees. And then with this darker color, I'm just going to place in some more shadows and accent some darker areas. So for example, over here. Now it's just a matter of looking at your reference photo and trying to pick out some things that you can see to add to the painting. Also up here, I want to make this part darker. And then next I'll poke back some of the sky holes. Just tapping around, adding more texture, more colors. Now I'm just going to mix in a bit more yellow and just tap around some more. Maybe I'll add some yellow ochre. I think I want some of that warm yellow accent in there. So I mixed in a little bit of yellow ochre and a little bit of white into the mixture. I'm going to clean that off, and for some of the branches I want to add a bit more depth to them and a bit more of a warm color. So first I'll start with the dark mixture, so just the burnt umber with some ultramarine blue in there, and just accent some of the darker areas. So I want this side to be very dark, and then I want to add a lighter color to the other side, so using some yellow ochre, some burnt sienna in there, and a little bit of white. I'm going to go on the other side and just add that light. So hopefully it will add some dimension to these branches. And I also want to really lighten that part up there. It is way too dark. It's really standing out in an awkward way. So lighten that part, and then I'll go over it with some foliage. And for the warm color, I'll mix in some more yellow ochre, some more reds. And just sweep that on here. Just give the tree trunk some texture. Clean that off, and I'm just going to fix up this branch here. It's a bit too thick, so I'm going to get some foliage in and around it, cover it up a little. And these branches here are also too dark, so using some white in this mixture, I'm just going to lighten them. Let's fix up this part first. I'm going to paint those branches back in over the top, and then I'm going to get a lot more foliage in there to cover up that bit where we repainted the tree trunk. So just mixing up some greens, And you can just scrub over it. Or stipple over the top. And then I'll clean this brush, and for the sky hole what I'm going to do is use the same colors I did for the initial background I did, so that will just be white and blue, and you want to use the cool blue color. And you're just going to stipple this back in to suggest light coming through. So it's most obvious around the center here, so that's where I'm going to place it. And it goes up into here a little bit. I'm just tapping this in. And there's a lot of it on this side too. That's where the light is peeking through. And it's these holes in the trees that create the dappled light on the ground, which we'll paint at the very end. And just a little bit on this left side, not too much. So I like how that just brings a little bit more light through. Then I'm going to paint a little bit of this green on the trees on the right side. So using some white and some of the cool yellow. Just on this right side, I'm going to sweep in a little bit of this color. It makes it look like there's moss growing on the tree, which when I was walking through this trail, there was a lot of really pretty moss growing on the trees. It was very, very green, so I really like adding this little detail. I feel like it makes it very true to what I saw when I was there in person. And don't want to overdo it or look like the trees are glowing, just tiny bit on the right side of the trees. And you can do it with paint that's a little bit thinned down, so that way you're kind of glazing it over. So now let's finalize the dappled light on the path, and then the last thing we'll do is just maybe a few more highlights in here just to accent some of the leaves a little bit more. So for the path, for the dappled light, we can either paint on darker strokes and leave the dappled light lighter, or we can paint lighter paint onto here to suggest the light. So I'm going to do a bit of a combination of both. I'll start with the light white color. So picking up a white, I'm going to keep it quite pure. Maybe add a tiny touch of yellow into there, so makes the light a little bit warm. And then because the light is coming through here, it kind of disperses this way, so there's an angle to it. I'm going to add some more white to it. I don't want it to be too yellow. And just going to tap these on. I'm keeping the paint a little bit thick so that this will go on easily. It will layer on easily. And it's a little bit more concentrated in the center. I like to use my finger too to smudge out the details, so that way it looks a little bit softer. And then what we can do is also just accent it by adding in some darker spots on the ground. So this is the ground color here, which is just burnt umber and ultramarine blue. So using this, you can kind of accent underneath some of the light areas you just placed in, and that way it'll create more of a contrast and make the light even lighter. And then you want to carry some of the dappled light through to the sides of the road as well. So picking up some of the white, going into the burnt umber mixture. And you just want to bring that light through. And for the side of the road, I'll make some areas a bit darker. So here, for example, here on the edge, I'm just going to get some texture in there to suggest some of the dirt and the bark on the ground, and also just cover up the awkward bit where the tree trunk meets the ground. And now I'm just going to fix up this tree a little as well. Really minor details now, just working on them. And on the ground, if you want, you can paint in some of the fallen logs. So you can see there's one here. Some twigs, branches, just textures on the ground. And then just add a little bit of light to them from above, and that way they'll look like they are round. And then there's also some moss growing on the ground, so with some very thin paint you can just glaze in a little bit of that green, just drop in a tiny bit of it. Helps to tie everything together as well. And now it's time to just accent any final lighter colors that you want in the painting. So I'm going to go into my yellow, my lemon yellow, with some white and a touch of blue. And going to really make some areas pop with this really bright color. Hopefully that'll provide the final bit of accent we need. Make sure you don't go overboard with this though. You don't want to be highlighting everything, just accent a few places. And then just switch up the color a little, maybe add a bit of warm yellow into the mixture, so that way it's not all the same color being spread throughout. And if you use your finger to smudge the paint like this, it just softens it out. And then I'm just going to go back and maybe place some branches in. It's the final finishing touches now. Alright, I'm going to say this painting is finished. So thank you for watching this tutorial. Hope you enjoyed following along, and please let me know if you have any questions about the painting or about the brushes. And I hope you'll look forward to the launch of the brushes in a few days time and my live stream that I'll be doing. I'll have more details in the description. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you guys then. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.